He was repairing an orc girl's armor. Then she whispered, "Go ahead." The rain came down in sheets, turning the path to his forge into black sludge. Kaelen didn't mind. He liked the sound of it drumming on the slate roof, a steady rhythm that drowned out the silence that had long ago become his only companion. The forge was his world, a small bubble of heat and labour carved out of the lonely foothills of the Withered Peaks. Here, the clang of his hammer was the only conversation, and the glowing heart of the coals was the only warmth he needed. Or so he told himself. The war was a decade gone, but its chill remained lodged deep in his bones. He'd been a boy then, a conscript taught to hold a spear and fear the green tide that swept down from the mountains. He had survived. Many had not. He returned not to a hero's welcome, but to a quiet homestead where the ghosts of his family were more present than any living soul. So he'd taken up his father's hammer and built a life from solitude and sweat, beating pieces of his past into plowshares and hinges. Tonight, the storm had teeth. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and he'd finished banking the forge early to check on the barn. It was a small, sturdy structure where he kept his dwindling supply of firewood and a few tools too worn for the forge, but too familiar to discard. He pulled his heavy wool cloak tighter, the damp cold seeping through. As he wrestled with the bolt on the old wooden door, a sound from within cut through the storm's fury. A scrape, a frantic, desperate noise. He froze, hand on the iron bolt. Rats, maybe, or a badger seeking shelter, but this sound had a weight to it, a panicked energy that raised the hair on his arms. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a blacksmith. His only weapon was the hammer on his belt, more a tool than a threat. He slowly, carefully drew the bolt. The door groaned open, revealing a sliver of deep shadow. The air that spilled out was thick with the smell of wet animal and something else. Fear, his own and another's. He held his breath, listening. A low growl rumbled from the darkest corner, a sound he remembered from the war. A sound that had preceded the screams of dying men. Orc. His blood went cold. Every instinct, every scar screamed at him to slam the door, bolt it, and run. But he was rooted to the spot, his knuckles white on the doorframe. He fumbled in his pouch for a flint and steel, his fingers clumsy with a sudden tremor. It took 3 tries before a spark caught on the tinder. He lit the small oil lamp he carried, its weak flame pushing back the oppressive dark inch by painful inch. And then he saw her. She was crammed into the corner behind a stack of old barrels, half hidden in the shadows. An orc. A female, he realized, his mind struggling to process the sight. She was younger than the hulking brutes he'd faced on the battlefield, but no less intimidating for it. Her skin was the color of mossy stone, and a pair of short, thick tusks jutted from her lower lip. She was wounded. A dark, ugly gash ran down her arm, and her armor, what was left of it, was a wreck of shattered steel plates and broken leather straps. It was fine work, though, he noted with a craftsman's eye. Far finer than the crude iron worn by the raiders he remembered. Her eyes, the color of amber, were locked on him. They held no malice, not yet, only a raw, cornered animal desperation. In one hand, she clutched a stub of a tallow candle she must have found on a shelf. She had been gnawing on it. The wax. his stomach turned, not in disgust, but in a strange, unwelcome pang of pity. Far away, beyond the drumming of the rain, he heard it, the faint, baying cry of horns. Torches, like angry fireflies, flickered in the distant woods at the base of the mountain. They were hunting her. She followed his gaze, a flicker of understanding in her wild eyes. Her knuckles were white around the candle stub. He could see the tension in her powerful shoulders, the way her muscles were coiled, ready to spring. She could kill him. Even wounded, she was an orc, fast, brutal. He was a man past his prime, with a bad knee and a heavy heart. He looked from the distant torches back to her, at the wax in her hand, at the hunger that was a living thing in her eyes. The soldier in him screamed, "Threat!" The man who had buried his own family whispered something else entirely. He took a slow step back, pulling the barn door wider. An invitation. Then he turned and walked away from the barn, away from her, leaving the door open to the storm. He did not run. He walked back to his forge, his home, the rain washing over him, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was the most foolish thing he had ever done. He returned a few minutes later. The lamp he'd left on a crate inside the barn cast long, dancing shadows. She hadn't moved from her corner. Her gaze was fixed on him, sharp and suspicious, tracking his every step. She had dropped the candle. It lay on the dirt floor, a pathetic, chewed thing. He carried a small wooden bowl and a hunk of dark bread. The bowl was filled with the mutton stew he'd made for his own dinner. It was thin, but it was hot. The smell of it, onion, salted meat and thyme, filled the damp air, a stark contrast to the cold mud and wet pine. He didn't speak. What was there to say? He walked to the centre of the barn, placed the bowl and the bread carefully on the ground, and then backed away slowly, his hands held open and away from his body. He retreated to the doorway, keeping a safe distance but not leaving. He wanted her to see him. He wanted her to understand. She watched the bowl. Her nostrils flared, catching the scent. He could see the war within her, the battle between gnawing hunger and deep-seated mistrust. An orc did not take gifts from a human. A warrior did not accept aid from a potential enemy. But a starving creature, hunted and wounded, was another matter. For a long time she remained perfectly still, a predator assessing a trap. The only sounds were the rain and the frantic beating of his own heart. Then, with a fluid movement that belied her injuries, she pushed herself away from the wall. She moved low to the ground, a hunter's crouch, never taking her eyes off him. She circled the bowl, sniffing the air. He stayed put, his back against the doorframe, letting the rain soak his shoulders. He made himself small, non-threatening. He remembered taming a feral dog once as a boy. The same principles applied. Patience, calm, an offering freely given. Finally, she snatched the bread. She retreated back to her corner in a blur of motion, pressing herself into the shadows. He heard the sound of her tearing at the crust, eating with a desperate, savage hunger. When the bread was gone, She watched him for another minute before creeping back out for the stew. She grabbed the bowl, her eyes still locked on his, and took it back to her dark sanctuary. The sounds of her eating were stark, primal. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had fed an orc, an enemy. His father would have called him a fool. The men he'd served with would have called him a traitor. He wasn't sure what he would call himself. When she was done, she pushed the empty bowl back out into the light with her foot. A gesture, not of thanks, perhaps, but of completion, an acknowledgement. Now he saw the wound on her arm more clearly. The gash was long and deep, cut through both leather and flesh. It was crudely bound with a strip of torn cloth, already soaked through with dark blood. It needed cleaning. If it festered, she would die, with or without her hunters finding her. He hesitated. Tending a wound was a different kind of contract than offering food. It required proximity, trust. It required him to touch her. He made his decision. He turned and went back to the forge, his mind a quiet blank. He was not thinking about the war or about fear. He was thinking about clean rags, hot water, and the pot of yarrow salve he kept for burns and cuts. A practical problem, a craftsman's problem. When he returned with his supplies, she was on her feet. She had straightened up, and the full height of her was startling. She was taller than him by a head, her frame corded with muscle. She held a broken piece of a barrel stave like a club. Her eyes narrowed. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. The words felt strange in his mouth. She answered with a low growl. The message was clear. "Stay back." "That wound," he said, nodding toward her arm. "It's bad. It will kill you if it's not cleaned." He set his supplies down where she could see them, the basin of steaming water, the clean linen strips, the small clay pot of green salve. He dipped a corner of a rag into the water and held it up. "Let me help," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She watched him, her knuckles white on the makeshift club. He saw the calculation in her eyes. She was weighing the threat of him against the certain threat of the poison in her veins. The horns sounded again, closer this time, a note of angry impatience in their call. Her jaw tightened. He took a single, slow step forward. She didn't move. Another step. The end of the stave twitched. He stopped, 3 feet from her, close enough to see the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the feverish glint in their amber depths. He held out the wet cloth, an offering. She stared at his hand, then at his face. He kept his expression neutral, his posture open. He was not a threat. He was a blacksmith, a mender of broken things. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, she gave a short, sharp nod. The stave in her hand lowered by a few inches. It wasn't surrender. It was a temporary truce, a calculated risk. He moved forward, his heart a trip hammer in his chest. He knelt before her, acutely aware of her size, her power. She could break his neck with one hand. He reached for her arm. Her muscles bunched under his fingers, hard as stone, but she didn't pull away. Carefully, he unwrapped the filthy bandage. The flesh beneath was swollen and angry. The cut was deeper than he'd thought, jagged and foul. He worked in silence, his movements economical and sure. He cleaned the wound with the hot water, flushing out the grime and grit. She hissed in pain, a sharp intake of breath, but she held still. Her control was absolute, forged in a discipline he could only guess at. He took a generous amount of the green salve and worked it gently into the wound. The sharp, clean scent of yarrow and pine resin filled the air. Then he took the clean linen strips and bound the arm tightly, expertly. It was work not so different from wrapping a handle or hafting an axe. It required a firm, steady hand. When he was done, he tied off the bandage and rose to his feet. Her eyes had never left his face. He had been so close, his life entirely in her hands. She had let him. He gathered his things. "Rest," he said, the word feeling inadequate. He turned to leave the barn. "Why?" Her voice startled him. It was low and guttural, rough like stones grinding together, but it was a word, a question. He stopped in the doorway, his back to her. He thought for a moment. He thought of the war, of the hate he was supposed to feel. He thought of the chewed candle wax and the desperation in her eyes. "Because no one should have to eat candle wax," he said, and walked out into the rain. The fragile truce held. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. When Kaelen went to the barn, she was still there. The hunter's horns were silent, for now. He had expected her to be gone, to have vanished with the night. Instead, he found that the pile of firewood he'd left in a messy heap near the door had been neatly stacked against the wall. Each log was perfectly aligned, the pile solid and square, a craftsman's work. She was sitting in her corner, watching him. The feverish glint was gone from her eyes. The swelling in her arms seemed to have gone down slightly. He gave a slow nod, acknowledging the stacked wood. She watched him, her expression unreadable. He left another bowl of stew and a piece of bread, and she ate it as he went about his morning chores, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. He fired the forge. The familiar roar of the bellows was a comfort, the routine a shield against the strangeness of his new reality. He had an order to fill, a new coulter for a farmer down in the valley. He worked the iron, drawing it from the fire, its light a blinding white orange. The hammer fell, shaping the metal, the rhythmic clang echoing through the clearing. He became aware of her presence at the forge door. She stood there, half in shadow, watching him work. Her gaze was intense, focused. She wasn't watching him as a man or as a human. She was watching the process, the fire, the hammer, the transformation of the raw material. He saw a flicker of understanding, of professional respect in her amber eyes. He ignored her, focusing on his work. He hammered and shaped, quenched and tempered. The hiss of hot steel plunging into the slack tub was a punctuation mark in the day's labor. When he was done, the new coulter lay on the anvil, cooling, its edge keen and true. He glanced toward the door. She was gone. He felt a strange pang of, not disappointment, something else. He went back to the barn. She was back in her corner, but on the grinding wheel in the corner, One of his old, nicked hand axes had been laid. He picked it up. The edge had been honed to a razor sharpness. The work was precise, masterful. Another gesture, a conversation without words. I see your skill. I have skill of my own. Days bled into one another. A strange, quiet domesticity began to settle over the forge. He would work, she would watch, or sometimes disappear into the woods for hours, returning as silently as she left. He learned she was a capable hunter. She would leave a brace of rabbits or a fat squirrel outside the forge door. He would cook them, and they would share the meal in the barn, sitting at a distance, the silence companionable now, not tense. He learned her name was Grathna. She spoke it once when he asked, the sound a low rumble in her chest. His name, Kaelen, sounded thin and brittle from her lips. One evening, he fell asleep in the chair he'd pulled up near the forge's dying embers. The day had been long, the work hard. He'd been mending a chain, link by painstaking link, and exhaustion had claimed him. He dreamt of the war, of mud and blood and the screams of his friends. He woke with a start, a cold dread clutching him. The first thing he noticed was the weight. Someone had draped his heavy winter cloak over him. It was old and patched, smelling of wood smoke and metal dust, but it was warm. The forge had been banked, but a few logs had been added, casting a low, gentle glow. He looked across the room. Grathna was sitting on a low stool on the other side of the hearth, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. She was simply watching the flames, her profile stark and noble in the firelight. She must have seen him stir, but she gave no sign. He sat there for a long time, the weight of the cloak a profound comfort. It was a simple act, a gesture of care, a debt for the bandages perhaps, or something more. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire or the wool. It was the first time in a decade anyone had shown him such a simple, unasked-for kindness. Later that week, as they shared a meal of roasted rabbit, he found himself speaking. "My father built this forge," he said, his voice quiet. He was a blacksmith, his father before him. Grathna listened, tearing a piece of meat from the bone with her teeth. Her eyes were on him. He wanted me to take it over, but the war came. He shrugged, the gesture feeling small and useless. I wasn't a very good soldier, just good at staying alive. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained from his work. When I came back, they were all gone. Fever took them, so I took up the hammer. There was nothing else. He hadn't meant to say so much. The words just came, spilling into the quiet space between them. She was silent for a long time, chewing slowly. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "My clan followed the oath of stone," she said, her voice a low rasp. "My father was the oath keeper." She paused, her gaze distant. "There are those who break oaths, for steel, for power." She touched the hilt of the broken sword that still hung at her hip. "They are oath breakers." It wasn't a story. It was a fragment, a piece of a puzzle he couldn't see. but it was more than she had ever offered before. He understood it for what it was, a piece of her history offered in exchange for his. The quiet that followed was different. It was filled not with tension or emptiness, but with the shared weight of their pasts. He, the failed soldier who found solace in creation. She, the betrayed warrior whose world had been shattered. They were two broken things, finding a strange sort of wholeness in this isolated place. He started repairing her armor. He couldn't help himself. It was a wreck, but the quality of the steel was remarkable. It was folded, layered, like the priceless blades from the East. He worked on it in the evenings, after his own work was done. He would bring a piece of it, a pauldron, a vambrace, into the forge. He would heat the dented plates, carefully hammering them back into shape on the anvil. He replaced the broken leather straps with new, supple hide. She would watch him, her expression intense. He felt her eyes on him, a silent observer judging his skill. One evening, he was struggling with a particularly intricate piece of filigree on a gorget. His fingers, thick and calloused, were too clumsy for the delicate work. She rose and came to stand beside him. He tensed, expecting a criticism. Instead, she pointed with a single sharp claw. "There," she grunted. "The twist is wrong. It should follow the line of the throat." She took a small, pointed tool from his bench and with a surprising delicacy bent the metal into the correct shape. The curve was perfect, elegant and functional. He looked at her, then at the piece. "You know armor." "I know what keeps a blade from a heart," she replied, her voice flat. They worked together after that, sometimes. She would point out the weaknesses, the places where a blow was most likely to fall. He would do the heavy work of forging and shaping. It was a partnership, an unspoken collaboration. He was mending her armor, and in a way he felt like he was mending something inside himself, too. The emptiness that had filled him for so long was being replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. The peace, of course, could not last. He knew that. It was a fragile thing, a bubble of warmth in a cold, hostile world. And one morning the bubble burst. He was checking his snares at the edge of the woods when he saw it. Carved deep into the trunk of a massive oak was a symbol. It was an orcish rune, he knew that much. But it wasn't like the intricate, flowing script on Grathna's armor. This was jagged, brutal, a stylized drawing of a broken tusk. His blood ran cold. It was a marker, a claim. It said, "We are here. We know you are here." He didn't run back to the forge. He walked, his steps measured, his mind racing. He had to be calm. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. When he reached the clearing, Grathna was outside, splitting firewood with the hand axe she had sharpened. Her movements were powerful and efficient. She looked up as he approached, sensing the change in him immediately. He didn't speak. He just jerked his head toward the woods. She wiped her hands on her leather breeches, picked up the axe, and followed him. When she saw the symbol on the tree, her face became a mask of cold fury. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound he hadn't heard since that first night in the barn. "Urgak," she snarled. The name was a curse. His mark. Who is Urgak? Kaelen asked, his voice low. The chief of the Broken Tusk clan, she said, her hand resting on the hilt of her ruined sword. A scavenger who follows the scent of blood. So they weren't the same ones who had hunted her before. These were new players, opportunists, vultures. It didn't make them any less dangerous. They're scouts, she said, her eyes scanning the forest. They will report back. The warband will not be far behind. How many? Enough. The single word was chilling. They returned to the forge, the comfortable silence between them replaced by a taut, grim tension. The world had intruded. The violence she had fled had found them. You should go, she said, standing in the center of the forge, the place that had become her sanctuary. This is not your fight. They hunt me, not you. He looked at her. He looked around at his home, the anvil, the hearth, the tools that felt like extensions of his own hands. This was his world, his life. He had built it from the ashes of another. He would not abandon it. He would not abandon her. No, he said. It was just one word, but it settled in the air between them, heavy as iron. They will kill you, she stated, not as a threat, but as a simple fact. Let them try, he answered, his voice quiet. He walked to the wall where he kept his finished work. He took down a heavy, broad-headed wood axe. He'd forged it himself. It was perfectly balanced. This is my land, my home. He looked at her, his gaze steady. And you are under my roof. A flicker of something he couldn't name passed through her amber eyes. Surprise? Respect? Whatever it was, it sealed their pact. They would face this together. They didn't have to wait long. The attack came at dusk. 3 of them. Orcs, bigger and more brutish than Grathna. They were clad in piecemeal iron and boiled leather, their shields painted with the broken tusk symbol. They emerged from the trees, moving with a confident swagger, their weapons held ready. They were scouts, just as she'd predicted, sent to test the defenses. The smithy has a pet, one of them bellowed, a cruel laugh tearing from his throat. The great Grathna hiding behind a human. Grathna didn't answer. She stood before the forge door, her sharpened hand axe in one hand, the broken barrel stave in the other. She looked small against the bulk of the approaching warriors, but she radiated an aura of lethal calm. The grind to the left of the woodpile, Kaelen said, his voice a low murmur from just inside the doorway. It's soft, a drainage ditch I dug last spring. It looks solid, but it's not. Grathna gave a barely perceptible nod. The lead orc charged, raising his jagged sword for a downward slash. Grathna sidestepped, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for her size. As he thundered past, she feinted toward his left, forcing him to adjust his footing. His boot sank deep into the soft earth of the drainage ditch Kaelen had mentioned. The orc stumbled, off balance for just a heartbeat. It was all she needed. Her hand axe swung in a vicious arc, biting deep into the back of the orc's knee. He roared in pain and fury, collapsing to the ground. She didn't pause. She brought the heavy barrel stave down on the back of his helmeted head with a sickening crack. He went still. The other two hesitated, their arrogant smirks vanishing. They had expected a cornered, wounded fugitive. They found a deadly, efficient killer. They came at her together, trying to use their numbers to their advantage. Kaelen's heart pounded in his throat. He was no soldier. His hands, so sure with a hammer, felt clumsy on the haft of his own axe. But he would not stand by. "The old stump!" he yelled. "The roots are above ground." Grathna heard him. She gave ground, drawing them toward the massive rotting stump of a tree he'd felled years ago. One of the orcs, focused entirely on her, tripped on a thick, exposed root. He sprawled forward. Grathna's foot lashed out, catching him under the chin. There was a snap of bone, and he fell backward, limp. The last one, seeing his companions fall so quickly, roared in rage and charged recklessly. Grathna met him head-on. It was not a battle of brute force. It was a dance of deadly precision. She deflected his clumsy swing, her axe a blur, and slammed the heavy stave into his shield arm, numbing it. As he recoiled, her own axe came up, quick as a snake, and buried itself in his throat. He collapsed, gurgling, and then there was silence. It was over in less than a minute. 3 large orcs lay dead in the clearing. Grathna stood over them, her chest heaving, blood spattered across her face. She was magnificent and terrifying. She looked at Kaelen, her eyes blazing. "You see," she panted, "this is what follows me." "I see," he said, his voice steady, though his hands were shaking. He lowered his axe. "Let's get them out of the clearing. The war band will come looking for them." They dragged the bodies into the woods, the grim work solidifying their strange alliance. The quiet domesticity was gone, replaced by the grim reality of war. They knew this was only the beginning. The first wave had been repelled. The main storm was yet to break. The respite was short-lived. Just as the last of the light faded from the sky, a new figure appeared at the edge of the forest. This one was not a warrior from the Broken Tusk clan. It was an orc female, old and grizzled, her face a roadmap of scars. She was leaning heavily on a spear, and one of her arms was bound in a crude sling. She saw Grathna, and her eyes widened. She staggered into the clearing and fell to one knee, bowing her head. "War chief," the old orc rasped, her voice filled with pain and reverence. "I thought you were lost. Urgak's filth scattered us at the pass." War chief. The title hit Kaelen like a physical blow. It echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the clearing. He looked from the kneeling orc to Grathna. Her face was grim, her posture regal. She was not just a warrior. She was not just a fugitive. She was a leader, a person of immense status and power within her own culture. Everything shifted. The fragile connection he thought they had built, the quiet partnership, the shared meals, the mending of her armor. It all felt like a lie, a deception. He wasn't her partner. He was her hiding place, a convenient tool, a simple, foolish human she had used to survive. The hurt was a sharp, cold thing in his chest. It was worse than fear. He felt a chasm open between them, a gulf of status and species he could never hope to cross. He was Kaelen, the blacksmith, the lonely man who lived at the edge of the world. She was a war chief. "Get up, Kasha," Grathna commanded, her voice hard, stripped of the quiet intimacy he had come to know. She was a commander addressing her subordinate. "What is the state of the warband?" broken, Kasha said, rising stiffly. Urgak holds the Iron Pass. He has sent riders to the clans, declaring you an oathbreaker, claiming the right of challenge by blood. And then the true army arrived. Torches bloomed in the darkness, hundreds of them surrounding the clearing. The forest came alive with the sound of armored bodies moving through the undergrowth, the clink of mail, the guttural commands of their leaders. A massive orc, broader and taller than any Kaelen had ever seen, stepped into the firelight. He wore heavy, black iron plate, and a massive two-handed axe rested on his shoulder. The broken tusk symbol was emblazoned on his chest. This was Urgak.
Grathna, his voice boomed, a sound of gravel and arrogance. You run from your fate, hiding in a human's hovel. Have you grown so weak? He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that was echoed by his warriors. Kaelen's home, his forge, was surrounded. The life he had so carefully, so quietly built was about to be obliterated. He looked at Grathna, at the war chief, and felt a profound sense of betrayal and foolishness. He had let the enemy into his life, not the ones outside, but the ones standing beside him. The battle began without a declaration. A volley of arrows thudded into the walls of the forge and the barn. One hissed past Kaelen's head, so close he felt its passage. They were trapped. "To the forge!" Grathna yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. She, Kaelen, and the old warrior Kasha retreated into the stone building. It was the most defensible position they had. The next hour was a blur of violence. Urgak's warriors threw themselves against the forge. They tried to smash the door down, their axes splintering the heavy oak. Kaelen and the orcs barred it with heavy iron stock. Arrows flew through the windows, forcing them to keep low. The air grew thick with smoke and the smell of blood. Kaelen was not a warrior, but he was a blacksmith in his own forge. He knew its every strength, its every secret. He directed Kasha to a loose stone in the wall, a small opening perfect for a spear thrust. He stoked the forge, not for metal, but for light and for weapons. He heated iron rods until they glowed cherry red, passing them to Grathna, who used them to drive back the orcs trying to pry at the window shutters. His world was being torn apart. The roof caught fire from a flaming arrow. The walls of his home, the place of his quiet solitude, were being battered down. And in the midst of it all, he felt a cold, hard anger solidifying in his gut. Anger at Urgak for destroying his life, and anger at Grathna for bringing this destruction to his door. In a lull in the fighting, as the attackers regrouped, Urgak's voice boomed again. "Give her to us, human. We have no quarrel with you. Give us the coward, and we will let you live in your pathetic little hovel." Kaelen looked at Grathna. Her face was streaked with soot, her armor dented from a blow that had nearly breached the door. She was breathing hard, but her eyes were clear and defiant. She was looking at him, and in her gaze he saw not the arrogance of a war chief, but a flicker of the same vulnerability he'd seen that first night in the barn. She turned from him then and faced the door. She took a deep breath. "Urgak!" Her voice was not a shout. It was a command. It cut through the night, silencing the jeers of the enemy warband. The authority in it was absolute. "You speak of weakness," she called out, her voice ringing with contempt. "You, who rule through fear and broken oaths. You do not understand strength." She turned, her fiery gaze finding Kaelen in the smoky confines of the dying forge. "This man," she declared, her voice loud enough for all to hear, inside and out. "This man is Kaelen, smith of this forge. He gave sanctuary to a hunted stranger. He showed kindness where others showed hate. He has a strength you will never know, the strength of iron that does not break." She took a step toward him, her eyes held his. "Before you, Oathbreaker, and before my own kin, I declare him forge sworn. He is not my shield. He is my partner. His forge is my hearth, and his hammer is my strength. An attack on him is an attack on me, and on all who still hold to the oath of stone." The clearing fell silent. Even Ergak was stunned into quiet. Kaelen stared at her, his mind reeling. Forge sworn. He didn't know what the word meant, not precisely, but he understood the weight of it. It was a public declaration, a binding, a political act of shocking defiance. In the middle of a battle for her life, she had raised him up, a lowly human blacksmith, and placed him at her side. She had not lied to him. She had simply been what she was. And in this moment, she had chosen to see him for what he was. Not a tool, not a hiding place. A partner. The anger in his chest dissolved, washed away by a wave of something powerful and terrifying and utterly new. "So be it," Ergak roared, his voice thick with fury at the public humiliation. "Then you will die together." The assault resumed, more ferocious than before. Kaelen looked at the ruins of his home, at the fire eating its way through the roof beams. His quiet life was over. It was ash and smoke. He looked at Grathna, who now stood waiting for his answer, her life and her future hanging on his decision. He could refuse. He could let Ergak's taunt be the truth, that he was just a human hiding in a hovel. Or he could stand. He walked to the anvil, his anvil, the heart of his world. He picked up his hammer. It felt solid and right in his hand. He turned back to her. "I accept," he said, his voice clear and steady over the roar of the fire and the clamour of the attack. "But I do not stand behind you, War Chief. I stand beside you." He walked to her, to the set of pauldrons he had been repairing. They lay on his workbench. He picked one up. The steel was cool and smooth beneath his fingers. He moved to fasten it onto her shoulder, his movements sure and steady. It was the same gesture she had made, allowing him to tend her wound. An act of trust in the midst of chaos. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a startlingly beautiful thing in her fierce, soot-stained face. "Then stand," she said. With his acceptance, the dynamic shifted. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was a participant, and this was his forge. "The quench barrel," he said, his voice sharp with command. "Tip it into the hearth." Grathna and Kasha didn't question him. Together, they heaved the massive barrel of water onto the superheated heart of the forge. The result was explosive. A massive cloud of steam and hot ash erupted from the forge's chimney and doors, a volcanic blast that billowed out into the clearing. The orcs outside roared in surprise and pain as the scalding cloud washed over them. It was chaos, a momentary
blinding confusion. "Now!" Kaelen yelled. "The back wall!" He led them to a section of the wall where the mortar had always been weak. Years of knowing his home, of feeling its every flaw, now became their salvation. With their combined strength, they smashed through the stones, creating a narrow opening that led out into the darkness behind the forge, away from the main force of the attack. They scrambled through the opening, choking on the smoke and steam, and melted into the night. Behind them, the sounds of battle gave way to the roar of the fire as the forge, his home, his past, was consumed by flames. They did not look back. They ran, 3 figures disappearing into the jagged shadows of the withered peaks, leaving the ashes of an old life for the uncertainty of a new one. Their journey took them deep into the mountains, to a hidden valley where the remnants of Grathna's clan, the Stone Hearth, had taken refuge. It was a grim, makeshift settlement of hide tents and shallow caves, filled with the wounded, the old, and the young. No more than 50 of them, all that was left of a once proud clan. Kaelen was an anomaly, an outsider, a human in a camp of orcs who had every reason to hate his kind. The children stared at him with wide, curious eyes. The warriors watched him with suspicion and open hostility. He was a weakness, a liability. "The war chief's human pet," he heard one of them mutter. Grathna, now fully in her role as leader, was consumed with the politics of survival. She met with her elders, planned defenses, and sent out scouts. She had little time for him, but her public declaration had given him a protected status. No one dared to harm him, but the animosity was a constant, oppressive weight. He did not try to win them over with words. He did what he knew. He found their forge. It was a pathetic thing, a shallow pit with a broken bellows and a few chipped, useless tools. The clan's smith had been killed at the Iron Pass, so Kaelen went to work. He spent the first few days just observing, walking the perimeter of the valley. He found a deposit of iron-rich rock and a vein of coal. He rebuilt the forge from the ground up, using flat river stones to build a proper hearth. He spent 2 days meticulously repairing the broken bellows with scavenged leather and his own steady hands. The orcs watched him, their skepticism plain. He ignored them. He worked from dawn until dusk, his movements deliberate and focused. He built his own world again, not with wood and slate, but with stone and fire. When the forge was ready, he began to work the metal. He started small. He repaired their cooking pots, their bent tent pegs, their dulled skinning knives. His work was clean, strong, and efficient. The orcs began to take notice. A mother hesitantly brought him a broken pot. He returned it to her, stronger than it had been before. Then he began on the weapons. Their arsenal was in a sorry state. Swords were nicked, spearheads were loose, axe blades were dull. He worked tirelessly, the clang of his hammer echoing through the valley. It was a familiar song, a declaration of his purpose. He wasn't a warrior, he was a smith, and a smith was what they desperately needed. One afternoon, a large, surly orc named Gore, who had been one of his most vocal critics, stood watching him work. Kaelen was reforging a sword, the metal glowing on the anvil. "Human," Gore grunted. "The balance on my axe is wrong. It pulls to the side." He threw the weapon on the ground near the forge. It was a challenge. Kaelen picked it up. He sighted down the haft, tested its weight. Gore was right. It was a poorly made thing. Kaelen didn't say a word. He heated the axe head, hammered it, reshaped the socket, and rehafted it on a new, straight-grained piece of ash he had found and seasoned. He worked for 2 hours, his focus absolute. When he was done, he handed the axe back to Gore. The orc took it, skeptical. He swung it a few times, his eyes widening in surprise. The balance was perfect. It felt like an extension of his own arm. He looked from the axe to Kaelen, a grudging respect dawning in his eyes. He gave a curt, stiff nod and walked away. It was a turning point. He was no longer the human pet. He was the smith. He had proven his worth not with a sword, but with a hammer. He had earned his place through the quiet integrity of his craft. Months passed. The valley became a fortress. Under his guidance, they forged better weapons, reinforced their shields, and even created simple caltrops to defend the narrow entrance to the valley. He taught 2 of the younger orcs the basics of the craft, his patience and quiet instruction winning over even the most hardened skeptics. He was seen. One evening, Grathna came to the forge. She was preparing for a council with a neighbouring clan, a crucial meeting to forge an alliance against Urgak. She was wearing her armour, the same armour he had begun to mend in his old life. It was fully repaired now, the steel gleaming, every plate and buckle secure. His own maker's mark, a simple hammer crossed with a mountain peak, was stamped discreetly on the inside of the breastplate, a secret between them. She stopped before him, and the usual crowd of onlookers melted away, giving them their privacy. "The buckle," she said, her voice quiet, gesturing to the strap over her heart. "It sticks." He stepped forward. The air was cool, but the heat from the forge wrapped around them. He reached out, his calloused fingers finding the familiar steel and leather. It was the same spot he had first seen the sigil of her rank, the symbol that had made him feel so small and foolish. Now, his hands moved with a quiet confidence. He was not her subject. He was her partner, her forge sworn. He adjusted the buckle, his fingers brushing against the hard plate of her armour. The tension that had defined their first interactions was gone, replaced by a deep, unspoken trust. Their bond had not been forged in soft words or gentle moments, but here, in the fire and the clang of steel. He met her gaze. Her amber eyes were soft, the hard edges of the war chief smoothed away for a moment. "You have given my people their strength back, Kaelen Smith," she said, the honorific a permanent part of his name now. "I just mended what was broken," he replied. He knew he was not just talking about the steel. His old life of quiet solitude was a distant memory, a ghost of a man he no longer was. That life had been safe, predictable, and empty. It had been destroyed, but from its ashes he had forged something new, a purpose, a partnership, a home not of wood and stone, but of loyalty and shared strength, built beside a woman who had seen the iron in his soul. He had chosen to stand, and in doing so, he had found a life far larger than the one he had lost.